From the dark jungles of Southeast Asia to the midnight sun of the Aleutian Islands, join Dr. Patrick Bays as he travels the globe in search of the next shockingly true surgery story. Today's show is sponsored by CurPoint Orthopedic, Seattle's premier cell-based medicine center. Your body, your cells. And now, CutSheet.
In the summer of 1989, on Luzon Island in the Republic of the Philippines, a group of children from a nearby village was exploring Green Beach. Now, Green Beach was a very dangerous place, having been used for years by the Marines, the SEALs, explosive ordnance disposal teams, and the fighter pilots for live fire training. What the children were after were the unexploded ordnances or bombs that they could carry back to their villages, break apart, and sell the components. In this instance, something went terribly wrong, and the bomb exploded, killing 2 of the children and severely wounding several more. Now, I had just entered the United States Navy as a naval medical officer and was stationed at Jungle General. This was my first assignment after my residency program. And as the name would imply, the hospital was located at the top of a mountain in the middle of the jungle that surrounded a military base at Subic Bay. The United States Navy had an agreement with the government of the Republic of the Philippines that our hospital, Jungle General, would be available on a case-by-case basis for humanitarian disasters. And in this case, the injuries sustained by the children in the bomb explosion would certainly qualify. Now, my patient who presented to the emergency department was a 10-year-old boy named Angelo. Angelo had sustained severe blast injuries to his left arm and to his right hand. His left arm was in very bad shape and was missing large sections from the elbow down. The right arm had fared somewhat better, but was still severely injured, with the thumb and index fingers missing. Because of the severe nature of the injuries to Angelo, I had to call my orthopedic surgery partner, Brian, who rushed to the hospital to assist me. And together we worked side by side in the operating room on Angelo's right and left upper extremities. Now, Brian did what he could for his left arm and tried to salvage as much as he could, but it was a pretty tough job. There wasn't much left to work with. I tried to salvage what I could of the right upper extremity. In my training, I had anticipated being in a situation like this, an isolated duty station somewhere in the middle of the South China Sea, so I made certain to receive trauma training that I would need to handle anything that might come through the door. In this case, it was training in hand surgery that was most important. I had seen cases like this before with my hand training at the University of Southern California and at LA County Medical Center, where there was a high volume of gunshot wounds. And I had trained with hand surgeons in Phoenix who were experts in the reattachment of severed limbs and digits, all skills that I would need for Angelo. In order to have a hand that functions on a basic level, Angelo would need something to replace his missing thumb. That way he could use his uninjured middle ring and small fingers in order to hold objects and use the thumb as a post. I had to build him a thumb post. This single element called prehension would be vital for a semi-functional hand for Angelo. Fortunately, I was able to move one of the bones of the hand called the metacarpal over to what remained of the thumb metacarpal. So I basically took one of the bones in the part of the hand that needed to become the new thumb bone. I had to get the length that I needed, and the bones had to be placed one atop of the other, almost like a totem pole. But more important than that, the bones had to be stabilized somehow. They needed to be welded together or fused. And for this purpose, I relied on a substance that orthopedic surgeons have been using for decades to fuse the bones: bone marrow. Now, bone marrow is a substance that lies in the center of a bone. It's spongy and filled with cells that can form new bone. Taking bone marrow from the inside of Angelo's forearm bones that could not be salvaged from the left arm, I had a ready supply. I was able to pack the new thumb post with bone marrow, and the bones were then pinned using stainless steel pins and covered with a flap of viable or usable skin tissue. I also included the nerves and blood vessels, the subcutaneous tissue, so that I could make sure that Angelo had something that was sensate, in other words, something that he could feel with, so that he could feel objects in the thumb post. Once the surgery was done, I dressed the wounds and put Angelo in a splint to protect his hand. checked him on a regular basis, and the wounds went on to heal. About 3 months later, the wounds had healed dramatically, and the thumb post had fused. And now Angelo had a rudimentary but functional right hand. Now, about the same time that Angelo was almost fully recovered from his injuries, I received a call from the emergency department about a new patient that had just limped in from the jungle. That's right, just limped in from the jungle. I arrived to find a man that looked to be about 40 years old, as thin as a water pipe, and that stood all of 4'9" tall. Shockingly, the man had a piece of splintered bamboo, about 3 foot long, sticking out of either side of his right thigh. The man was a Negrito and went by the name of James. James was a descendant of the indigenous people of the Philippines, whose ancestors went back to ancient civilizations that lived almost 40,000 years before. The original Negritos were hunter-gatherers, and to a certain extent the modern Negritos were very much the same. They hunted small game in the jungle and caught fish in the sea, which they prepared and cooked in campfires scattered around their villages. And they gathered anything that they could find and repurpose, things that they could put to good use. Items of importance, such as large cardboard boxes that could be used for mattresses to sleep on, and corrugated metal that was used to reinforce their huts. They lived in small villages in the jungles around the naval base at Subic Bay, and the United States government had a contractual agreement with the Filipino government that would provide for the complete and total medical care of these indigenous people. Thus, all any Negrito needed to do if they wanted or needed treatment from any of the Navy doctors was simply ask for it, just as James had sought care when he went to the emergency room to see me. And of course, all of this was completely free of charge, compliments of the United States military. Since the Negritos spoke in a dialect of their ancestors, specialized interpreters were required for me to better understand what was going on. And through my interviews with James, I learned exactly what had happened to him. About 6 weeks prior, James had been up in a palm tree cutting palm fronds, which he intended to use to reinforce the thatch on his jungle hut. Unfortunately, he was distracted by a monkey and had fallen from the palm tree, landing in a clump of bamboo. One of the stalks of the bamboo snapped off and pierced his right thigh, almost like a toothpick sparing an olive. James told me that the injury had been quite painful and that he had not been able to bear any weight for weeks. I learned through the interpreter that the village had commissioned the services of a local shaman or medicine man who would travel from village to village treating sick and injured villagers. The interpreter had heard of the shaman, as the interpreter knew that he had treated many patients with whom she was familiar. Now, typically the treatment involved the use of things like roots or plants, which were often compounded into thick pastes that could be applied to wounds to prevent infections or improve swelling. In some cases, the medicinal agents were brewed into some types of elixirs or teas that the patient could drink to alleviate their pain or temper the effects of their fever. But James' condition had worsened to the point that he had no choice but to come to Jungle General. After interviewing James, I took the bandage scissors and removed what was left of a tattered pair of jeans that had been split along the sides to allow for the protruding stalk of bamboo. And what I found was shocking. His thigh was about twice the size of normal. It was swollen with large amounts of pus oozing from either side of the bamboo. Obviously, it was infected. He needed to have a full neurologic examination, which I performed, and I found no evidence of any injuries to the nerves. This was very reassuring. But I needed to know more about what was going on underneath the skin, and so I ordered x-rays and a CT scan. As I stood at the view box examining the x-rays and the CT scan, I had a much clearer understanding of what was going on with James. The bamboo stalk had caused a fracture to the femur or the thigh bone that had become infected. The medical term for a bone infection is osteomyelitis. And I could see the infection and how the infection was not only preventing the bone from healing, but was also eating away the good bone around the fracture. I knew instantly that James would need to be taken to surgery at once to remove the bamboo shard. That was obvious. But I also had to deeply clean the infection, and I would have to stage a procedure to fix the fracture once the infection had been resolved with antibiotics and with subsequent cleanings. About an hour later, James was under anesthesia with his right thigh prepped with iodine and draped with sterile sheets. We had taken him directly from the evaluation area in the emergency department to the operating room, Now, prior to actually beginning the operation, we cut off one end of the bamboo shard that was flush with the skin. We did this before we draped it with sterile drapes so that we wouldn't drag any additional contaminated debris into the wound. We removed all the sections of shards that we could on the one side of the thigh, but we didn't pull the rest of the shard through the thigh because I didn't want to damage any internal structures like arteries or nerves. I made an incision, and the dissection was meticulous, given the large amounts of nerves and arteries traveling in the vicinity of the bamboo shoot. It took a while, but eventually the bamboo was removed, and I was able to take a really good look at the bone itself. The bone was clearly fractured. However, had it not been for the infection, I'm certain that the bone would have healed on its own, without the need of any orthopedic hardware such as plates or screws or an internal nail that would go down the center of the femur. But because the infection involved a large section of the bone, part of the bone had been eaten away from the inside out. Thus, the bone was in the process of becoming extremely unstable, so much so that I felt that it might snap at any moment were James to bear weight. In fact, I was actually surprised that he was able to come in from the jungle with the wound and the fracture and the condition that was in. Thus, I was dealing with two major problems. Now, the first was the bone infection. That was the most urgent thing that needed to get taken care of. And the second was this onset of an unstable fracture. And I felt that each problem would have to be dealt with in stages. Stage one was to clean out all of the infection, get the bamboo shoot out, inspect the area very closely. And stage two was to fix the bone with orthopedic hardware. I proceeded with the first order of business, which was to clean out the infection. Now, in orthopedics, we have a saying, the solution to pollution is dilution, which simply means that I had to use large amounts of fluid using a device called a pulse lavage, which essentially is a jet of sterile saline that can be used to clean out debris and infection, much like a hand-powered wand that one might use to power wash their car at a car wash. After taking cultures and manually cleaning out the infection with surgical instruments, I performed a procedure called irrigation and debridement. That just means cutting out the damaged and dead debris and also irrigating meticulously all the soft tissue and all around the bone that was fractured. I wanted to make sure that there were no shards of the bamboo still in place. I had to make sure that all the foreign debris had been removed and that the wound was crystal clear. I used about 15,000 cc's of normal saline, and I pulse lavaged this into the bone and soft tissue. And once cleaned, the wound was packed with gauze, and I placed the leg into a long leg splint to stabilize it because I was afraid of him moving it and causing the fracture to get worse. Now, my plan was to initiate large doses of IV antibiotics and perform repeated irrigations and debridements until I was absolutely certain that the infection was gone or well on its way to being gone. And at that point, I could focus on fixing James' bone. We were now on stage 2, the fixing of the bone, which began about a week after we began. By then, we had adjusted the antibiotics for maximum effectiveness based on what organisms we'd cultured out of the wound at the time we first did cultures and did the first irrigation with James. But now we needed to fix the bone, and we had to do so with internal plates and screws. As important, we needed to replace the bone that had been eaten away by the infection. So, again, we went to the same source we had with Angelo, bone marrow. However, in James' case, we didn't have non-salvageable bones available as we had for Angelo. So we had to go find it somewhere else. And where we went for the bone marrow was the same place that orthopedic surgeons have been going for bone marrow for decades, the pelvis. The best part of the pelvis to harvest bone marrow from during surgery is along the front portion of the pelvic bone called the iliac crest, which lies just above the hip joint. In this case, I was able to make an incision, open up the iliac crest or the pelvis, almost like a window, take a small instrument in there, almost like an ice cream scoop on a small scale, and fill a medicine jar with enough bone marrow to completely pack the portion of the thigh bone that had been eaten away by the infection. And once the bone was packed with bone marrow, and I was happy that it was going to most likely heal in that condition using that substance, I fixed a long, wide stainless steel plate with multiple threaded screws that ran from one side of James' thigh bone to the other, and this construct held everything together. We kept James in the hospital for about 6 weeks until we were certain that the infection had cleared and that the bone was stable and well on its way to healing. Now, normally, patients don't spend that length of time in the hospital after surgery. Most patients can be discharged to home or to a skilled nursing facility in some instances. However, James's case was very unusual in that he had nowhere else to go other than the jungle. Thus, I needed to make absolutely certain that his condition was well enough that he could return to the jungle and not get hurt or not get another infection. James did very well and became a favorite of the nursing staff because of his positive demeanor and his ready smile. Eventually, James had progressed to the point that I felt it was safe to discharge him using special crutches that we had made that would be more suitable for a jungle environment. Now, James was able to bear some weight, but the crutches were there to assist him just in case he needed them. So on a bright Sunday morning, 6 weeks after he had arrived, James was discharged back to the village in the jungle. It was surreal. I'd never in my entire career discharged a patient to the jungle. But as I watched James use his crutches to help him walk down the small embankment and disappear into the trees, I felt a sense of satisfaction that we had helped someone who really needed the help. About 2 weeks after James had been discharged from the hospital, I had a colleague come up to me in the hospital to tell me that James was outside and that he had something waiting for me. I went outside and found James with his wife and 2 teenage children. The interpreter was standing next to them, but she really wasn't needed because it was obvious what Jim was trying to say. He was no longer using the crutches, and he wanted to show me how well his scar had healed, and he had something for me. A gigantic 3-foot monitor lizard that he had killed and carried around his neck like a necklace. James took the lizard that he had killed and proudly handed it to me as payment for services rendered. And I've got to admit, I was stunned. Not only had James' obvious gratitude touched me, but the form of payment, I'd never had anything like that before. I graciously took the monitor lizard and handed it to one of the security guards who were standing nearby. I shook hands with James and the other members of his family, and I thanked all of them for coming to see me and for their extraordinary act of gratitude. Now, they say that in medicine everything happens in threes, and so it was in this instance, because not long after the Green Beach bomb explosion blew off parts of Angelo's left arm and right hand, and not long after the trauma that James suffered from falling from a palm tree and having a shard of bamboo pierce his right thigh and fracture his femur, I was called to the emergency department on perhaps the most shockingly strange and bizarre case of my career. The case involved a Filipino fisherman who was scuba diving in the South China Seas that surrounded the naval base at Subic Bay. Now, scuba diving is very common in that area, as the Philippines has some of the best diving in all of the world. But in this case, something went very wrong, or so I would soon learn. As I walked into the emergency department, I immediately noticed 3 things. The first was a patient with a spear from a spear gun sticking out of his left arm just below his left elbow. The second was an X-ray on the view box that depicted the skeleton of something that was clearly non-human. But this non-human X-ray was adjacent to an X-ray of the bones of a human's left forearm. And both, the non-human and the human, had been pierced by the spear from the same spear gun. The spear had ended its journey with its flange extending about 4 inches below the elbow and having fractured both the bones and the forearm. But I was still confused. To what did the other non-human skeleton belong? Well, as I walked further into the emergency department and near the patient, the answer to that third question became obvious, because lying on a countertop right next to the patient was a stingray. Apparently, the scuba diver had shot his bolt at the stingray, which was positioned between the spear gun he was holding in his right hand and his left forearm. The spear had apparently pierced the stingray and continued its journey into the patient's left forearm. Thus, when he presented to the emergency department, he had a stingray that was attached to the spear gun tip, the portion of the spear gun that went into his arm. So it was his left arm with the tip of the spear in it, a stingray, and his body, and the spear gun. Everyone was confused. The medical staff went ahead and cut off the stingray prior to my arrival, and some of the staff were trying to determine how they wanted to prepare it for dinner that night. As I spoke with the patient, who I found out his name was Pedro, he thought the best way to remove the spear from his left arm was just to pull it out right then and there. And I told Pedro that that was not really an option because looking at the x-rays, the flange from the spear gun tip had deployed exactly as it should have when it strikes prey so that the prey cannot escape. But in this case, I advised Pedro that his left forearm had become part of the prey. Once I had convinced Pedro that the spear could not simply be yanked out of his forearm because of the risk of injuries to vital structures like arteries and nerves, he agreed that the best course of action was to do this procedure in surgery. In addition, there was not an insignificant issue of the forearm fractures, the fractures to the two bones. I had explained to Pedro that he had fractured both the radius and the ulna, the two bones that make up the forearm. But not only had they been fractured, they had been severely fractured with one of the bones in multiple pieces, similar to what one might imagine if you struck a piece of chalk with a hammer. I told Pedro that I would have to fix both bones with specially designed plates and screws. I also told Pedro that at least one of the bones, the bone that had the section with lots of small bone fragments, would require bone grafting to aid in the healing process. Yes, the exact same type of bone graft that I'd used to rebuild Angelo's thumb and to repair James' broken femur. And so I took Pedro to surgery. Now, I had some concerns that I might not be able to close the flange at the end of the spear tip. Had I not been able to do so, I would have had to have gone to plan B, which would have involved cutting the flange with bolt cutters, somewhat like cutting off a lock from a storage facility. Luckily, the flange closed easily, which made removing the spear very much the same, quite easy. It came right out. I was actually shocked and surprised, but pleasantly so. That said, as I inspected the position of the spear tract in the forearm once the spear had been removed, I realized that Pedro had been extremely lucky that he had not severed any large arteries or nerves that were right next to where the spear had entered. It was almost as if the spear tip had miraculously missed all the vital structures, almost like it had a guidance system on it. That said, the two bones in the forearm had not fared as well, and each bone had to be anatomically reduced, which means put back into the proper position, and rigidly fixed with plates and screws. And the ulna bone, that bone that almost looked like a piece of chalk that had been hit by a hammer, required bone graft that I took from the pelvis. After surgery, we followed Pedro very closely for the next 8 to 12 weeks, and by 8 weeks, x-rays revealed that the fractures were well on their way to healing. And so Pedro ended up doing quite well after this very unusual injury. And so there you have it. 3 completely different types of orthopedic injuries, and each with its own unique set of circumstances. In the first case, Angelo had sustained an explosion injury to his left arm and his right hand as he and other children were attempting to break apart a bomb back at their village. A bomb that they had found on Green Beach and from which they intended to sell its components for money. Now, 2 of those children tragically were killed, and the others were severely injured. I had rebuilt Angelo's right hand by building him a new thumb post, which was held together with stainless steel pins and supplemented with a magical ingredient called bone marrow. This was necessary so that Angelo could grasp objects and hold on to things with his right hand. In our second unusual case, this was the case of James, who had fallen from a palm tree onto a cluster of bamboos and had been impaled by a 3-foot shard of bamboo through his right thigh. He was the one that was taken care of by the medicine man for about 6 weeks, but didn't get better. In fact, he got worse, and he came into Jungle General with a severe infection to his right thigh, as well as a fracture. This was the case where the infection had started eating the bone and the fracture was becoming more unstable. We took James to surgery and patched him up with multiple surgical debridements. We also used antibiotics, and the fracture was eventually fixed with plates and screws, and again, that magical ingredient, bone marrow. And last but not least was Pedro, who had perhaps the most bizarre case of all. Remember, Pedro shot himself with a spear gun while hunting for stingrays. He not only hit the stingray, but he impaled the spear into his left forearm. He too underwent surgery and had his left forearm bones fixed with plates and screws, and again, bone marrow. So what's an important characteristic that all three of these cases had in common? Well, they all required bone marrow. So what is it about bone marrow that makes it so special? And how did it allow Angelo, James, and Pedro to grow new bone? Well, to understand that, we need to look at how bones are put together. Anatomically, bones are one of the most interesting tissues in the body and serve a variety of vital functions. First, they form our skeletons, which allow us to stand upright. Second, they serve as an attachment site for ligaments and tendons, which allow us to move. Third, they help protect our internal organs. And fourth, and most importantly for our cases, they function as a storage center for minerals, fat, and cells that can replace damaged or dying cells. This is exactly what we used in these three patients. The thick outer portion of the bone is called the cortical bone, while the soft spongy material inside in the middle is called the bone marrow. And it's in the bone marrow, residing in specialized locations called niches, where restorative bone-forming cells reside. But what exactly are these bone-forming cells? And is it just new bone that they form, or do they form other things as well? Every single day, billions of cells in our bodies die. And every single day, billions of cells in our bodies are replaced or repaired. Dr. Arnold Kaplan, considered one of the pioneers in bone marrow research, stated that, in quotation marks, every second 15 million blood cells will drop dead in your body. And every single second, 15 million blood cells are replaced. This is what keeps us alive. The source of those blood cells is bone marrow, stem cells, and without them, we die, in quotation marks. From an orthopedic standpoint, we're particularly interested in adult mesenchymal stem cells, a term coined by Dr. Kaplan. These types of cells can become bone cells or cartilage cells that allow us to heal. That's what's most important in orthopedic surgery. They allow us to heal fractures or repair articular cartilage. They allow us to do fusions on low back surgeries, or in Angelo's case, to fuse his thumb post together. However, recently, Dr. Kaplan, based on new, exciting research, renamed these cells adult medicinal signaling cells, as they appear to create the conditions necessary for resident stem cells to become activated. Suffice it to say that the National Institutes of Health have referred to stem cells as having two characteristics. First, they can proliferate by replicating themselves millions of times from a single cell. Second, they can transform into the type of tissue that's needed the most in a process called differentiation. In the case of our three trauma patients, Angelo, James, and Pedro, what they needed most was new bone, and their own body's bone marrow stem cells went to work to do just that. I hope that you have enjoyed today's presentation of CutSheet, and I hope you tune in next week as we delve into new and exciting, shockingly true surgery stories. My name is Dr. Patrick Bays, your host on CutSheet.